the island became more productive in the sense that they were able to produce more or produce the same amount in less time, and which then gave them additional time, which would be available to do other things that would then lead to higher levels of productivity. So anyway, it was a good class, and then it was a lot of interaction with the students. So and then I also started a company called the Giants of Political Thought. That was also back in 1985, because I believe that in fact, even in the world we are literally in right now, we're beginning to see the power of ideas.
Hey weirdo, welcome back. I'm excited to welcome Crom Carmichael to the show today. Crom is a Vanderbilt graduate who has spent decades at the intersection of business and political thought. As an early-stage investor, he's backed over 60 startups and currently serves as CEO of Nashville Biotech and founding investor of Seraph Group. But Crom is perhaps best known for his work in political education through Giants of Political Thought, an audio series covering influential thinkers like Thomas Jefferson, Adam Smith, and John Locke that has reached over 100,000 customers. He co-hosts the weekly From Our Generation podcast with Mike Hassel and is a regular panelist on the Michael Patrick Leahy Show, where he provides commentary on current events through a libertarian lens. A pivotal 1980 monetary reform conference shaped his worldview, leading him to become a vocal advocate for free market principles and limited government.
Are you wasting hours every week on clunky systems and manual processes just because every consultant's told you enterprise solutions cost tens of thousands of dollars? That's a lie, and it's killing your business. If you're a small-town entrepreneur, a growing business owner, or a nonprofit, you already feel the pressure. Every hour wasted on spreadsheets or duct tape apps is an hour stolen from actually growing your business. Here's the truth. You don't need a massive budget to compete with an enterprise level. I'm Cody, the Weird Canadian, and I've spent over a decade building multi-billion-dollar systems for government and Fortune 500 companies. Now I bring that same expertise to entrepreneurs like you with scalable websites, custom applications, and smart automations, all built on a shoestring. My process is simple. I analyze your business to see where you're bleeding time and money. I strategize the high-impact solutions for your budget. I execute systems that scale with you. And I optimize so you keep on growing without adding chaos. And on top of that, I'm there with you to explain every process and how it works and why it works for you. Now imagine having enterprise-grade systems that save you hours a week, let you compete with the bigger players, and give you confidence knowing your business runs smoothly, even while you sleep. That's the freedom you've been chasing. Stop waiting. Start scaling. Book your strategy consultation today, and let's build the business systems you deserve. Looking forward to working with you, and let's stay weird.
Now, some people who don't like Charlie Kirk, for example, think his ideas are terrible and harmful. Other people who think his ideas are good, obviously they like the ideas. But ideas have power, and ideas always precede change. For good or for bad, ideas always precede change. And so what we try to cover in the Giants of Political Thought are the ideas of people whose ideas generated change. And some of it was negative change, some of it was positive change, but even ideas that generate negative change have an appealing ring to them. so
in terms of that topic, I just want to get into that for my viewers as well, just to say, well, I didn't agree with Charlie Kirk. Nobody should be assassinated for any sort of beliefs that they have, and just being like, he was a critic by talking about it. Like, he wasn't inciting violence. He wasn't he was just putting his opinions out there. And that really sets a precedent for everybody now. Like, you've now got a standard of, if you set your beliefs out there, there's a potential that you can be assassinated for what you say, and purely what you say, not what you do.
Yeah. And by the way, that's not new. That has been true for hundreds of years. It doesn't make it right. In fact, you and I both agree it's wrong, but it is a fact of life since the beginning of time that people who are in power do not like being challenged. And Charlie Kirk had no political power himself. He had none. He had the ability to express himself, and either people would agree with him or disagree with him. But that's all the power he had. He couldn't pass legislation. He couldn't make you do anything. But the reason that I believe he was assassinated was that he was persuasive. And whether you agree with him or disagree, he was persuasive, and that is threatening. So if you go back in history, for example, John Locke, who wrote 2 treatises of government, he had to write that under a fake name. And he had to, when he would exchange ideas with friends, he would use codes, which I think some of the codes that we have in the recordings about 2 treatises of government are kind of funny because they seem kind of obvious. Like, the baby has been born. Please come in 2 weeks to see the baby. And so that's not that. Somebody ought to be able to figure out that was code for a new book. So at any rate, but Charlie Kirk, I'd be very interested in discussing the ideas or what Charlie Kirk said that you didn't agree with, and kind of because there was a lot that Charlie Kirk said that I did agree with, and there's a lot that Charlie Kirk said that I probably did, because I would see some of the things that Charlie Kirk said, but not the full body. And so
my main concern is just around the rhetoric for the LGBT community. Like, not to say like he was bashing it at all. Like, he had great points. The issue I had more with it was because I don't care what you do behind closed doors. That's my whole thing. And it just felt like it was trying to incite a lot of people on the other side. I get to see it from the outside, right? Like, I don't have that view that the Americans do because I'm in Canada. But I just know he was a divisive character, and a lot of his ideas and things he talked about, I didn't always agree with. Abortion being one of those, like, things to do with bodily autonomy more than anything else. People should be allowed to do whatever they want with their bodies, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, well, I'll say this. I think that of the things that Charlie Kirk talked about, those 2 things are the ones that he has described as being most divisive. But those weren't the things that were most threatening to the people of the elites that didn't like him, because what he really talked more about that really threatened them was our constitutional order at the beginning of the Constitution, at the beginning of when that document was passed, what it was designed to do, what it has ultimately failed to do, and what the problems are that then face our country because our constitutional order that was originally passed is no longer the case. And that's what he articulated that upset people the most, although they couldn't say that because it was kind of like, I don't know if you saw the interchange with Tim Kaine, Senator Tim Kaine. I don't know if have you seen that, where he said that to the person who was testifying at a confirmation hearing, and the person who was testifying made the comment in his opening statements that there are certain rights that come from God to the individual, and the government cannot justly take away those rights. And Tim Kaine took exception to that, saying that all rights come from government, and which from an American perspective, and perhaps a Canadian perspective, but from an American perspective, that's absolutely false. I mean, we fought the Declaration of Independence over the question of whether or not there are any God-given rights, and then whether or not the king had usurped those rights unjustly, and giving us the right to declare our sovereignty. And so Tim Kaine is not just a senator; he's a senator from Virginia, of all places, the home of Thomas Jefferson, and he was Hillary Clinton's VP candidate. And apparently he doesn't understand the Declaration of Independence because he doesn't know what it says. And in addition to that, he says that God-given rights is the basis of Sharia law, which is also incorrect. And that's the kindest way to say it.
Yeah. So in Canada, it is more like the government has given you your rights. Like, unfortunately, especially over the past 20 years, we've put in legislation that basically takes away a lot of Canadian rights. But I do believe that nobody should be held to any government institution. They should be free to do as they please, as long as they're not harming any other individuals. Like it's common sense, like it's not this weird rule out there. Like it's if you ask any individual, they're not going to tell you where they get the rights from. They're going to tell you, like, I'm a free person, I can do what I want. And even in Canada, we break so many laws, we don't even know we're breaking them half the time.
Yeah, but then but then in Canada, my sense of it is, and this is true in the U.S. too, unfortunately, and that is, if the government decides that you need to be found to have broken law, if the government decides that for a particular individual, they can find a law that you've broken, and that's not a good.
I break 3 on a daily basis by doing just this.
Okay. Oh wow. Okay. Well, yeah. I hope you're in a safe place. So far,
Thankfully, I'm not big enough.
Yeah. Well, so far I can respond to you and not have people show up at my door. But that's see that. So what I would say is this: the divisiveness, and I'm going to put that in quotes, the divisiveness of Charlie Kirk was more about the issue that we're talking about right now, that there's so many laws that the government imposes. And I believe that the governments in general, this is historical, governments impose enough laws so that they can go after anybody they choose to go after. And that's a much more important and bigger issue to the individual than the social issues. But he was attacked on television for the social issues and the positions that he took. But he always said, we may disagree, and I will tell you why I think what I think and express my and support my positions through logic as well as certain religious principles that he has. But he always said, I can always defend everything I say through logic. I don't need religion to do it. But religion for him was the basis. That was the fundamental foundation. Everything for him was built on top of that. But it's going to be interesting to see, because I've thought about what this very subject of Charlie Kirk, and there are people in the past, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King are two people who were assassinated, who did not hold political positions, but were very influential within their particular area. Malcolm X was I believe he was assassinated because his views on the direction of the Nation of Islam, I think it contradicted some other people within the Nation of Islam. And so I think he was assassinated more or less from within. That's never been proven, but that's what I think.
Question you on that? I've been hearing a lot lately about Islam, and especially when it comes to Trump and what's going on in the United States right now. Has the U.S. always been that way towards Islam? Like, just always catered to what they ask?
Well, explain that a little bit more. What the question? When you ask about Islam in the United States, has it always what?
Has it always been a precursor for what has happened? Like, what is going to happen? Like, I've been listening to a lot of Andrew Bustamante and some other key political figures in the United States, and their justification always seems to point back to Israel and the Islam State. I'm just trying to figure out how the two intertwine, because every major event or major thing always seems to coincide with the two countries coming together, like those two things.
Well, gosh, you've asked a really big question. I have spent a lot of time over the past 15 years trying to understand the distinction between a Muslim and an Islamist, even though they both believe in Allah and believe in Muhammad. and if the Muhammad was he lived in Mecca as a young man, and he when he was in his early 40s, he proclaimed that Allah was the one and only God, because the Middle East at that time was a polytheistic area. But he decreed that Allah was the one and only God, and that he was Muhammad's one and only prophet, and that anything that he said was true because Allah would speak through him. And through a period of 10 or 12 years in Mecca, he had about 150 followers, and he had a wealthy uncle who was very powerful in Mecca, and so nobody did anything to Muhammad because of the powerful uncle. And then when the powerful uncle died, the other people in Mecca, and Mecca was not a big place, went to Muhammad and said, "We're really kind of tired of you telling us that we're supposed to bow down to you. We need you to leave." And so he went to Medina. And when he went to Medina, he changed from being just a prophet to also a prophet and a warrior. And the last 9 years of his life, he went to war on average of every 7 weeks. So that's a lot of war. And he conquered Arabia. And when he conquered Arabia, that part of Arabia was what is now Israel. And of course, Israel has that area that's called Israel has a history that goes back thousands of years. And there's been conflict in that area for thousands of years. Even before the days of Muhammad, there were still wars between the Israelites and other people in that region. And so, but when Muhammad was on his deathbed, he told Abu Bakr, who is his right-hand guy, "You need to get all the Christians and Jews out of Arabia." And Abu Bakr then did that. And so then but Israel, the Jewish people have always believed that Israel is their homeland. And so you have a conflict that I don't know it has a particular answer. If you have people who have at their most fundamental level have a disagreement that is it doesn't allow for both of them to live next to each other. And history has also kind of shown me that while most people are not violent, it only takes less than 1% of any population that is violent to destroy the population. In fact, it probably takes 1/10 of 1%. And so we live in, and then the more efficient, if that's the right word, the weapons are, the more mayhem violent people can bring on society. So I don't think there's necessarily going to be I don't think there can possibly be a two-state solution just because of the nature of things. It'd be nice if there were, but I don't think there will be. But as far as Islam in the United States, I think probably the obviously 9/11 in the United States changed the way people look at in the United States, who now look at people who are, I'm not going to say Muslim, but I'm going to say Islamists, because I think there's a difference. And in fact, when you read the Quran, and I've not read the Quran, but I've read a lot of things about the Quran, but I have read the Sirah, which is the life of Muhammad, a translation of it. And but the Quran that it's written chronologically, and so in Mecca, Muhammad as a prophet was a prophet of peace. When he moved to Medina, he became a prophet and a warrior. And so his methods of expanding Islam, his methods of doing that moved from persuasion to war. So in that part of the Quran, it contradicts the first part of the Quran. So if somebody says Islam is a religion of peace, they can refer to the Mecca part of the Quran. If they say it's a religion that can allow war, they go to the Medina portion of the Quran. So it's very complicated.
Very fair. Okay, just to back up a little bit, do you think there's going to be more political violence in the United States to come?
That's obviously a question on many people's minds. We're in a place where that I am in, and I'm basing this more on when Rahm Emanuel. I'm kind of fumbling around here. Rahm Emanuel once said, "Never let a crisis go to waste," and Rahm Emanuel meant when he said that is that anytime there's a crisis, there's an opportunity for government to become more powerful. And that was really the context that he put that in. And I think that my view of American politics right now is that the Democrat Party is the party of bigger government. And the reason for that, what drives that is that we have very, very powerful government employee unions. We have 7 to 8 million dues paying members of government employee unions. Now, many of them are paying dues. They're not paying dues because they want to. They're paying dues because the law requires them to do it. And so, for example, in California has 11% of the population of the United States, but it has 24% of all government employees who are members of unions. And so the government employee unions in California, no Democrat in California can get into elected office if they oppose the government employee unions. And then you have to look at the business model of a government employee union. How does a government employee union increase its revenue? There's only one way, and that is to have more government employees. So what's interesting is government employee unions say they look out for the welfare of government employees. And my response to that is, no, you don't. You look out for the welfare of the government employee union and the people who run the union, because you would much rather have 10,000 inefficient employees paying dues than 5,000 efficient employees. And so government in the first place is inherently inefficient because it's not by definition innovative. It cannot be innovative. Government can't be. But then when you stack on top of that, the business model of government employee unions, they want it to be inefficient. And then they want more employees because they claim in the absence of more employees, we can't do what you want us to do. And then if you give them more employees, if you raise taxes and give more employees, it gets worse. Yeah. So they need more money and more employees. And so the Democrat Party, if I could do one thing in the United States, it would be to eliminate government employee unions. Not because I'm against government employees, but because I'm against the power of the very few. When we talked earlier about the 1% or the 1/10 of 1%, it gets to the 100th of 1% or the 1,000th of 1%. There, of the 7 to 8 million government employees, there's 100 that control those unions. And even though 40% of government employees vote Republican, almost all the money that they give, and they give billions, because they collect an average of $900 a year per member. Yeah. 7 to 8 million times 900 is $6 billion every year. And that $6 billion is they spend every penny of it trying to make government bigger and more powerful. So getting back to your question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So getting back to your question, which is the question of the day, will there be more political violence? If the government, to the extent that the government employee unions feel threatened, as the greater the threat, the greater will be their reaction. And then they're in bed with a lot of media people who have found that their niche is to try to get 20 to 30,000 paying subscribers, so that then they can make a nice living off of that. But then they have to say things that 20 to 30,000 subscribers want to hear, and so the social media is getting more extreme for business reasons.
So you touched in a lot of points that I've been emphasizing about the Canadian government. One of the major problems is we have unions that basically, I remember when I was in the government and working for them, my union was telling me who to vote for. In newsletters telling me who I should be voting for.
So
I don't
help
think.
me understand, because I've told you about America. Tell me, I am not. I knew that
Yep.
there were unions in Canada, so please tell me about, because you all Canada is a nation with provinces. Is that the best way to describe it? And then
Yeah,
within the provinces are cities.
cities and municipalities that serve. So there's three levels of government essentially as well. The main problems tend to be around the provincial governments more than anything else, and the federal. Municipalities, well, they're having less and less money coming in. They are doing the best with what they can, like just trying to keep up. They are poised. I am very happy about this because municipalities and small towns are poised to be a boom in the next 10 to 20 years with all the space and infrastructure building that they can take on.
Okay.
I assume that they're going to become the technological hubs as small towns eventually. The problem with our province and our federal governments is unions, is bloat, is corporate consultants. One fact I found absolutely atrocious is 40% of our Canadian population works for the government in some way, shape, or form. 40,
Yikes.
40.
Of
And
the
then,
of the working age of all of the employees in Canada, 40%.
yes,
That's astounding.
yes. That
Okay.
includes consulting services,
Oh, okay.
like the
Well, now you
entirety
know
of it.
what? The way you define, that's an interesting way to define an employed by government, because in the U.S. This is interesting. In the U.S., our healthcare system, we spend $5 trillion total on healthcare. $5 trillion if you count everything. 60% of the people in the healthcare system are in the payment part of the system. Only 40% provide healthcare.
Yep.
And so if we're counting the way you're talking about it, which is a very interesting way of doing it, all of the employees in healthcare, whether they provide healthcare or whether they're in the payment system, which is incredibly inefficient. And it'd be interesting sometime to get into a discussion about how our healthcare system in the U.S., and I would like to do this and compare it to how Canada, I know how our healthcare system got to be the mess that it is.
Yep.
And I know the Canadian healthcare system has its issues because many Canadians come to the U.S. to get surgeries, and they pay in full and get tremendous discounts when they come to the U.S. to have the surgery done, because they pay in full and there's no third party insurance that the providers have to deal with. But please go ahead.
So yeah, it's just that. It's not even just the people. So our services have been degrading for years and years and years because our government has been bloating and bloating and bloating, with consultants telling people what to do and things like this. My fiance works in a hospital, and it's a small hospital on the island, but it's one of the only hospitals that has an ICU, like, for the rest of the island. We're in a central island. There's one in St. John's, and then ours is for the rest of the island. And this ICU is so understaffed, underfunded, they have no supplies. They run out of supplies constantly. Nurses are quitting at record paces. They're bringing in travel nurses just to keep up with the supply. Doctors don't help out with the nurses and the things like that as well. So we have this system where the services offered are so slow and encumbered because there's not enough actual staff doing the services. They're all in the behind the scenes doing the paperwork, the scheduling, the managing.
Yeah.
You have about 1% of the actual service doing the service work, where 99% of it is behind the scenes doing nothing.
Okay. Well, then we have the same problem. And I can tell you a little bit. By the way, what island are you on?
Newfoundland.
Oh, Newfoundland. How close is that to Nova Scotia?
It's about 7 hours by boat.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, it's not that far then. You're in that same general area. Yeah. Okay. The U.S. healthcare system got to where it is today. It started at the end of World War II. Roosevelt, during the Second World War, had put in wage and price controls. toward the end of the Second World War, business people went to Roosevelt and said, Mr. President, we're making a lot of money. And if you want to keep the price controls on, that's okay. But could you take off the wage controls so that we could pay our employees a higher wage? And Roosevelt said, no, but I will let you pay for their health insurance. And so that gave rise to the third-party payment system, because businesses that are in the business of making cars, they're not in the business of healthcare. So they need help, and our top marginal tax rate at the end of the Second World War was 94%. And people got the middle income people, if you were in the upper, just kind of the upper part of middle income, you were in the 50% bracket. And so having your health care paid for by your employer was like a big pay raise. Yeah. And for the employers, they could deduct for tax purposes, providing the health insurance. And so then in the 50s, the private sector unions all had their contracts include health care from the first dollar. So that required the third party payment system to be involved in even a doctor visit, which back in those days would have cost $10 if it weren't for the insurance. And so then in 1961, President Kennedy signed an executive order allowing government employees to unionize. Up until 1961 in the U.S., government employees could not unionize. So our unions are a function of statutes, not a function of the Constitution or anything else, just a function of statutes. But then all of the government employees, they then bargained for really, really gold-plated insurance plans. And then Medicare passed, Medicaid passed in the 60s. And so now bigger and bigger chunks of people were having their health care paid for by the government, which meant that there had to be now a bigger third-party payment system. And so now, as I said earlier, and then Obamacare passed in 2010. And so now about 20% of the population it really has a very, very hard time paying for the premiums, even though they make good money. Small and medium-sized businesses have a hard time providing a quality healthcare plan for their employees without it costing them and putting them out of business. And so it holds down wages. It particularly hurts younger people because younger people are healthier as a group by far than people my age. But yet they're the ones who are having to pay for my health care out of their insurance premium, which they don't need. And so it's very unfair to young people, but young people in the United States don't understand that because it's not, excuse me, it's not properly explained to them.
That is a very strong caveat that I've realized a lot, especially through this, is nothing's explained to anybody. Literally, you are not taught how to be an adult, ever. You are just making things up as you go, and you're hoping it's the right path. And I just have to say to our audience, that's the same for our politicians. They don't know anything either. They're just following along like they think they should, and you know they're not looking into your best interest at that point.
But by the way, that is historically always been the case. Politicians, that's why the French Revolution happened. That's why the Glorious Revolution in Great Britain happened. You know, it's very interesting with the founding of America after the Revolutionary War, the 13 colonies decided they were going to be 13 states. And so they met and spent 90 days approximately drafting the Articles of Confederation. And then they took 2 years after they drafted them to get the 13 states to ratify the Articles of Confederation, and they were sufficient for 5 years. And then the people said this isn't going to work. And part of the reason was that under the Articles of Confederation, each state had the right to coin money. Well, if you have the right to coin money, then you can export your inflation as long as other states would take your currency. And so every state, and by the way, there's a lot of that going on today.
Yeah,
because
forex markets.
Because of federal largesse. You have states trying to get their populations to be counted as large as possible because they get more federal dollars. And that helps drive our federal deficit higher, because at the state level, they claim they care about the federal deficit. They claim it, but then their actions, especially in the blue states, are exactly the opposite. Because
they just have
because
to.
They live.
Sorry, I just want to say something here. In Canada, it's actually the opposite. We don't even have our prime minister is just printing money without even coming up with a budget. We haven't even established a budget for this year yet, and he just keeps on printing money. So just a little tidbit of how it's going in Canada right now.
Well, it's not that much different here, because if we don't pass a budget, we pass what is called a continuing resolution, which just means we're going to continue to do what we've been doing. And then we have these entitlement programs that are, that fund whatever is asked is paid. And so there's no budget, for example, for Medicare. There's no budget for Obamacare. There's no budget for Medicaid that anybody has to live with, because it is merely an entitlement. And if our senior citizen population were to have an increase in life expectancy, then our Social Security system would blow up. For the last 10 years, life expectancy in the U.S. has not increased, and so Social Security has fallen within the predicted range. But Medicare, Medicaid, and Obamacare have not even come close to falling within the predicted range. And so Canadians and Americans share a similar fate in terms of deficit spending. How bad is your deficit in Canada? And I'm now talking about at the national level. How big is it compared to, say, your GDP? Because in the U.S. under Biden, our deficit got up to where it was about 8 to 9% of our GDP, and that is
the Canadian federal government general deficit is around 1.6% of GDP in 2027. But I'm assuming these are not real numbers. I don't trust the government's numbers, because they pat them down. They have metrics to throw them through so that they're sanitized. I know we're going for the first time where our payments are outweighing our deficit.
Okay. Well,
we're
Cody,
just getting into that territory.
It shows that people, regardless of where they are, they react to things pretty much the same way. And I think what you're expressing is, if you say 40% of Canadian workers are paid because of government, they have an interest in government staying big. And in fact, they probably have an interest in government getting bigger. You have the same fundamental problem that exists here in the United States. Now, I live in Tennessee, and Tennessee for years, our state constitution had two things in it that constrained government. One is there was no income tax in Tennessee, and the other was that they had the state had to balance its budget. And so even when Democrats were in charge of the state of Tennessee, which was for decades, Democrats were fiscally responsible. I don't know if it's because they wanted to be or whether they had to be, but they were, and they couldn't tax people's incomes. So in order to get more revenue, the only thing they could do was increase the sales tax rate. And so in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the sales tax rate would inch up about every 5 years. It'd go up maybe a half a point. And then it reached 9.5%. And Democrats concluded that they couldn't raise it to 10% to double digits. And so then they spent 15 years trying to beating the drums that even though the Constitution, our state constitution, clearly says there can be no tax on income, they said, well, that's not what it means. And so for 15 years, they tried to say that the Constitution allows for an income tax. And then toward the end of that 15 years, they actually had polls showing that 70% of Tennesseans wanted an income tax, which was absolutely false. In fact, I was doing talk radio at the time. And so when the final poll came out right before the state house was going to call the income tax to the floor, our local newspaper, which is quite left, had a poll. The headlines was 70% of Tennesseans support an income tax. And so here's how they got to that. They polled people, and the first question they asked was, do you want the children, would you like for the children of Tennessee to be better educated? Well, 98% of the people said, yes, I would like for the children of Tennessee to be better educated. And so then the next question was, if the only way for the children of Tennessee to be better educated was to pass a small income tax, would you support a tax so that children can be better educated? And 70% said yes. Now, to that. Now, if you just went out and did a poll and say, do you support a state income tax? 70% said no. Yep. So this gets into how the establishment, which wanted an income tax, how they will pervert the truth to try to accomplish their goal. And fortunately, it did not pass in the state legislature because there were 5 very brave Democrats who tricked the Speaker of the House and tricked him into thinking that they would vote for it. But what they had told him was individually, they said, I'll vote for it. And the Speaker of the House, his name was Jimmy Nathie. And Jimmy Nathie could be a very, very tough guy. And so you didn't want to tell Jimmy Nathie, if you were a Democrat, that you're not going to vote for the tax. So what they told him was, Jimmy, I will vote for the income tax as long as my vote, my individual vote, is the one that puts it over the top. Because as soon as I vote yes, I'm going to lose my next election. And I will lose my next election for my loyalty to you. But I'm not going to lose it unless it means something. So you can count on me for that last vote. So he thought he had 5 yeses and he had 5 nos. And when he called the vote, these 5 people ran to the 4 corners of the chamber and one stood in the middle. And Jimmy Nathie held that vote open for 3 hours, and he could not get any of those 5 people to move from where they were. And he's running around there trying to get them to all come in one spot. And they said, no, I'm going to stay right here. And after 3 hours, he realized he'd been had. And then since then, Tennessee has become a red state. And we have eliminated our estate tax. We've eliminated our tax on interest and dividends. We have solved workman's comp, or we've addressed it. We have solved tax tort reform to some extent. And so Tennessee is a among the 50 states. And we also, and you'll get a kick out of this, we also in the 80s passed a gasoline and diesel tax. And Lamar Alexander was our governor, and he negotiated that tax with the Democrats. But he said, I will only agree to that if the money that we raise can only be spent on roads and bridges. And so the way that law was passed is that money is restricted for being used on roads and bridges. And we pay for our roads and bridges with cash. We don't bond them. So Tennessee is the lowest indebted state in the country per capita. And we have no income tax.
I might move to Tennessee.
You'd be welcome here.
I don't know how well the weird Canadian would do in Tennessee, but
you do pretty good.
It's interesting that getting into that, because Canada has a lot of those problems that you emphasize. We've tried to solve the too big government by restricting spots, but then by restricting spots, that made it so that the work couldn't get done. So then they hired consultants to go do the work that aren't consulting. It's literally how everything in our system has failed. Is just because we tried to restrain ourselves, and then somebody thought out of the box and like, okay, well, I'm just gonna do this that has nothing to do with anything in the rules that we've stated, and create something brand new. And it's just came into this beast that doesn't serve us. But even the regular citizens don't know the intricacies of these systems.
No, it's very difficult. And the people who do have a common interest to grow government, they do know what they're doing. The leaders of those groups, they know exactly what they're doing. And so it's very, very difficult to build because you have this immovable object and all these different things. In Tennessee, we had a constraint that government couldn't overcome. And now that Republicans are in charge, they actually strengthened the constitutional amendment even more so that it'll become even more difficult in the future. But there's some Republicans in Tennessee who'd like to spend more money, but they can't get more taxes. And so they're constrained. And I think that that's part of human nature, is that in the private sector, in our personal lives, we are constrained by the amount of money we make. So we have to generally spend within a constraint. But at the government level, we don't. And corporations, by the way, corporations, in order to continue, they have to spend less money than their revenue in order to survive. And if they want to grow, then they have to make a profit so that they have the capital to expand their business. And so those are natural constraints that are imposed on people at the individual level and on companies in the private sector. But if those same people in the private sector worked in the government sector, they would think differently because of the sector they're in. And I don't know how to solve the problem other than through education. And that's what Charlie Kirk, you're familiar with the things that you disagree with him on. You agree with him on 90% of what he talks about. It's the other things, the social issues, that you don't. But he spends most of his time not on social issues, but on the very subjects that you and I are talking about today. And I am having a great time, by the way.
So I enjoy these conversations because I don't get a whole lot of people to chat with them about, because they don't understand the complexities. I'm a special individual because I've been in government, I've been in fintech, I now started my own business. I literally killed my entire career, left everything to move to a new place and start over. And mainly because I just think the world doesn't work as the way anybody thinks it does. And there needs to be people that are starting to stand up and say, hey, this isn't right. Canada has become way too liberal for this stuff. When I said I'm breaking 3 laws, there's 3 internet online laws that we have: the Canadian Online Harms Act, the Canadian News Act, and there's the Canadian Content Act or something like that. Basically, they state that you have to be Canadian. We'll promote your content through, we'll change the algorithm so that Canadian content gets promoted more, but we're going to determine who's Canadian. We're going to determine what content comes out. And on top of that, the government also pays our mainstream media to do media, to talk about news, to do these things. And now we have a whole bunch of independent media sources standing up on their own resources, on grassroots, like myself, standing up and talking about the truth. And it's starting to resonate with people. People are starting to learn that, hey, let's listen to the outside, because it doesn't seem like the inside is actually giving us the information we're looking for.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, that's
yes.
What you're describing in Canada is, that describes Charlie Kirk. He is, I'm 77 years old, and I think back to, he was assassinated when he was 31. And I think back, and I had actually a weekend when I was 31 that changed it was an inflection point in my life. I didn't know it was going to happen, but in 1979, that's when I was 31. You weren't even a thought at 1979. But in 1979, we had inflation in the U.S. of 18%. Interest rates were 18 to 20%. And I was in a business, and I had a wonderful partner. And we were Converse athletic shoe distributors for 11 states. And Converse back in those days was a big deal. But we had $4 million of bank debt, and we were paying 18% interest rates. And back then, $4 million was a lot of money, and 18% was a very high rate. But Converse would raise the price of their shoes every 90 days, 3 to 4%, which meant that the value of our inventory went up 3 to 4%. And so consequently, the price increases paid for the interest on the bank debt. And that seemed weird. And so I was looking around trying to find a source that could help me understand what was going on. And there was a conference in New Orleans called the International Conference on Monetary Reform. And I read about it, and it said it would help me understand the current situation and tell me what the future would be. And I said, well, gosh, I sure would like to know that. So I go down to that conference, and there were 30 or 40 speakers. And one speaker would get up and say, we're going to have hyperinflation. Here's why, and here's what you should do. And that speaker would sit down, and I go, wow, that's a compelling argument. I better prepare. And the next speaker would get up and say, we're going to have massive deflation. Here's why, and here's what you should do. And I said, man, that is a compelling argument. I better prepare. And then the third one would get up and say, we're not going to have this. We're not going to have that. We're going to have a return to the norm. And here's why, and here's what you should do. Well, my future wife asked me, she said, well, baby doll, what'd you learn from all those speakers? And I said, well, I learned that I am profoundly ignorant. And she said, oh, no, you're smart. I said, well, that's debatable. But whether I'm ignorant is not. And I said, because I've just heard 3 different scenarios for the future. Logic tells me that one of those 3 will be more accurate than the other 2. And I don't have a clue which one that is. That is ignorance. And so I then became a student of economics. And so for the next 5 years, I studied, I looked at trends, I looked at history, I looked at all kinds of things to see if I could find things that would give me a basis to say, okay, if this is happening now, then this is what it means. And I've gotten to be good at that. And so, but you have to, it's not an easy thing, and it's not a natural thing. And I think
you have to want to know the information.
Yeah, you have gone through that. How old are you?
I'm 33.
33.
I got my financial education through the GameStop saga. There's a big part of that whole debacle. I also learned about I got in early in Dogecoin. I read the Bitcoin white paper back in 2011. I honestly think Bitcoin is perfect money, and once governments start implementing it as a basis for our fiat system, we're going to be better off. But until then, we're stuck with the crappy system we have. It's funny because I actually did a video diagnosing the Canadian monetary system and how it was a different beast than how the US system was made. Like, Canada stepped up and said, well, Federal Reserve is private interest. It should really be public interest. And they made it a Canadian public company. But the problem is it's still a centralized monetization system. It's not even run by our governments. It's an outside company loaning the money to the government to sell and spend. So you're paying on money that the government could be creating itself, which makes absolutely no sense. It just kind of highlighted that the monetary system doesn't make any sense to anybody. And if you look into its history, it's literally rigged. The whole reason it was set up was to rig the system. And it's just like, okay.
There's a book. What you are describing sounds a lot like our Federal Reserve System. But there's a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island.
Yep.
Have you read that book? Talking
about. Yes, I have.
Oh, good for you. That's fantastic. And it tells you the history of how the Federal Reserve came about. And we do, we have a fiat currency, and kind of the way that I look at things is, if you have, just to kind of oversimplify, but not by much. If you're increasing if your deficit is running 3% of your GDP, and you have productivity gains of 3%, you should not have inflation, because if you don't have a deficit and you have productivity gains, then prices should fall. But if you have inflation equal to productivity, then they'll be flat. Now, but then it gets into, how do you define productivity? And if part of the way you define productivity is to figure out ways to describe government as being more efficient, you're likely skewing your numbers, and you're probably doing it intentionally.
Yeah. And
so it's hard to identify productivity. So you kind of have to look, to me, what I do is I kind of look at things in general, and especially in technology, and say, how is this making people more productive? And for example, AI, customer facing AI will probably, I don't know about other areas of AI, but customer facing AI is going to increase productivity dramatically in customer facing.
Yeah.
In that area.
So I'm a former software developer. That's the business I run as well. I help small businesses build custom software that they need, not the ones that everybody's selling them, basically to solve their individual problems. But I'm heavily leveraging AI because it gives me superpowers. I've been a coder since I was 16 years old, and now it's like I'm supercharged. Things that would take me 6 or 9 months to a year now take me a week or two. So
Now
I definitely
that's
see
how
credit.
that's how you are using AI to increase your own productivity. And then what is it that what are you building with the AI that then goes to the next step to make other people? What are you doing in your company?
So I go into businesses, I analyze where they have automation problems more than anything else, where their time is spent on when they don't want to do things, or things that are repetitive that can be automated, or even custom interfaces that they need, like custom connections between different applications I can do. It's really dependent on what will make them more productive, take away from the less productive work and give them more empowered to do the fun stuff, the things they enjoy doing, the things that actually are going to drive them value.
Okay. All right. Well, that is you're creating great value then by helping people do more in less time. When it gets that goes back to the island where people are doing more with the same amount of time because you're helping them with their current systems. So anyway, that's fascinating. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed this discussion and would be happy to have another one with you in the future, assuming you don't get caught.
I'm sure I'm far away from that. We only had one podcaster get banned so far in Canada. It's still very hard to get through our political system because it's still a new law, and judges are still very much hesitant on charging on them. But we have had one prominent podcaster get silenced off the air because of it.
Okay, now I'm curious, what did that podcaster? You all do not. The Canadian does Canada have we have a formal constitution? Does Canada have a formal constitution?
Don't believe so. I think we just have a Charter of Rights.
Okay, is speech one of them?
I think no. Actually, that changed in 1970. We ended up adding a line to it that stated hate speech was labeled as something completely different and is crime.
And then how the government defines hate
is up to them.
What determines. So what did this podcaster say or allow to be said that caused him problems?
Took a article from a mainstream media source, actually went through the article, gave actual sources, and basically showcased what the article was missing, how it was missing, and how it was creating a narrative. Because right now, the way the Canadian government operates is they can go directly to Google, Meta, everybody, and just say no. And Google, Meta, everybody, it just has to comply. Okay,
yeah, sure, because otherwise the government would just turn them off. And so, this is also, when you look at history, businesses have always been compliant because it's in their interest to be compliant if government tells them to do something. It's because it's kind of like the way Google operates one way in the U.S. under a certain code, but they're forced to operate in China under a very, very different code if they want to operate in China at all. If somebody's interested in knowing more about history, we created back in the 80s, we created audio cassette tapes back in those days on history's most influential thinkers. And these include people like Machiavelli, the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, the Social Contract, Civil Disobedience, the Communist Manifesto. So it's the Reflections on the Revolution in France. So it's mostly about Western thought and the development of political thought. But if you include socialism as a Western concept, which it is because it came out of Karl Marx and he was European. And so socialism and communism. So we cover about 500 years of history. And what we do is we provide context for every one of our programs. So we don't just tell you what they say. We tell you what the circumstances were at the time that particular thinker lived, what impacted that particular thinker. And so we put those on audio cassette. We call them the Giants of Political Thought, and we have a website called giantsofpoliticalthought.com. And people can go to that website. Now, they have to download an app, but if they do download the app, then they have access to all of the audio. It's about 36 hours. We cover 16 different thinkers. When you have the app, you also have access to all of the transcripts. You also have a series of questions on each of the programs, and those questions are divided into questions of fact, questions of meaning, and then some classic questions that don't really have a particular answer that would be a great for a teacher who's got students. Those would be the types of questions that would create tremendous discussion. And they're all centered around the ideas expressed by a particular thinker.
I'll make sure it's in the description below for all of our audience. Thank you very much for coming on, and I hope you